Throughout history, writers have always looked towards the future and wondered about innovation and the speed of progress. In ancient Persian stories, authors pictured humanity among the stars. British sci-fi imagined what a world of mass surveillance would be like, and French novelists described the first moon landing. However, we stand in the midst of the 21st century, and we've passed years that served as the setting for many science fiction movies and novels, such as 1984 and 2001, A Space Odyssey. Tonight, I'll be giving a rundown of a very interesting iceberg that has great execution, posted by the user Makalowski. Good evening everyone, my name is Boomslang. As always, I have decided to skip the first tier so we can immediately get into some more obscure topics. A link to the full iceberg is available in the description. Tier 2. Paris in the 20th century. This was a partially unfinished work by the famous Jules Verne, author of books like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It was written in 1860 and published in 1994. Paris in the 20th century revolves around the life of a 16-year-old boy named Michael Dufresnoy. Michael is an aspiring poet growing up in the year 1961. Technology is at the forefront of education, and poetry and the other arts have been abandoned in favor of the study of mechanical devices and electricity. Michael attempts to pursue a career in writing, but in this mechanized world, traditional sources of income, such as reporting and writing, are unprofitable. The book was an expression of Verne's concerns about the rapid change in progress and innovation through machinery. Some concepts of the book that resemble our current timeline are working combustion engine-powered cars, computers, skyscrapers, and a network similar to the internet. Overall, it's fascinating to me that Jules Verne, a man whose novels revolve around scientific discovery and the progress of technology, would write a story warning of the dangers of mechanical innovation. Looking backward. In this book, protagonist Julian West is suffering from insomnia. He decides to rely on hypnosis to sleep, and falls into a deep sleep after being hypnotized by another character called Dr. Leet. Julian is woken up 100 years later, and is given a tour of the socialist utopia that is the 19th century by the descendants of the Leet family. Production is nationalized in this new society, and private ownership of goods and monetary funds no longer exists. Everyone strives towards a common goal, and the state exists to serve people and find the best job for each individual. The state is protected by an organization called the Industrial Army that serves as both a workforce and a national guard, with military rankings and titles for its members. Food is free. Who can imagine having to stand in a bread line in a socialist government? And prisons don't exist, as criminality is near extinct, considered a sign of mental regression. The book was written in 1888 by English writer named Edmund Bellamy. Gulf in the year 2000. I know I messed that up. This story follows similar conventions to the previous entry. The main character, Gibson, falls asleep and wakes up 108 years later in the year 2000. He's shown around by the current resident of his home. Gibson learns all about the innovation now incorporated into the game. Clubs automatically record their owner's score, automated caddies are widespread, and jackets that yell 4 whenever the user makes a swing are common. The Super Male. This book was published in 1902 and was set at the tail end of the 1920s. It's a primarily satirical work that features the story of a team of enhanced cyclists racing against a train, as well as the story of a superhuman male renowned for his physical strength and skills at lovemaking, like you do. Lord of the World. Lord of the World is a 1907 novel written by Robert Hugh Benson. It details the trajectory of a world in the near future, with weapons of mass destruction, international communication, and high-speed travel commonplace. God and religion are extinct, and belief revolves around the Nietzschean statement, man equals God. The adhering to this law results in a being known as the Antichrist, a politician, becoming the Lord of the World. only a small remnant of believers exist and resist against this one-world, atheistic government. The Golden Book of Springfield. This book is a work of utopian fiction published in 1920 by the American poet Vachel Lindsay. It's a work that is delivered in the format of a dream journal, but in the last section, it transitions to first-person perspective from the author. I found few sources explaining the plot in full, but from what I could piece together, the book features multiple spiritual undertones and chronicles the transformation of Springfield, Illinois from the 20th century to a full utopia in the year 2018. Some interesting elements include a war between countries utilizing UFO-like flying machines, and the Church of Springfield, a pacifist religion that combines elements from multiple contemporary belief systems, and the replacement of Jesus by Buddha. The Last Man on Earth. This 2015 TV series is set in 2020 and follows the adventures of Phil Miller, the sole survivor of a deadly pandemic that swept over the world. Phil Miller spends his time searching for other survivors and painting signs that say he's located in Tucson, Arizona. After years of meeting no one, Phil runs his truck into a rock at full speed to attempt to leave his mortal shackles, but at the last moment he sees another survivor. He survives the crash and meets the survivor, who is a woman named Carol. The two try to get along despite their clash in personality, and the TV show follows the pair in their adventures across the US. I mean, I love the premise, but the thought of a pandemic sweeping the country in 2020 is pretty weird. Captain Future. There's a variety of different comics with the name Captain Future, but in this case, I believe the Iceberg author was referring to the anime by that name. Captain Future initially aired in Japan in 1978, and it told the story of Curtis Newton, an orphan who lost his parents in an artificial satellite crash when he was an infant. He ends up meeting a diverse cast of characters. His mentor is Professor Simon Wright, a brain preserved in a transparent life support system, and a pair of humanoid robots named Greg and Otho. These people serve as the support crew for Captain Future, and they all serve aboard the ship Comet, traveling around the galaxy to fight crime and solve injustice. Overall, it has a cult following in Europe, and the soundtrack for the German version is worshipped by many fans for its aiding of the show's atmosphere. Not like there's a lot of atmosphere in Captain Future's setting. Runaround. Runaround is a 1941 story set in 2015, and it is one of the earlier stories written by the famous sci-fi author Isaac Asimov. The book is set early in the I, Robot canon of stories. The main plot centers around two men who have landed on the surface of Mercury, named Mike Donovan and Gregory Powell. These two men have been on the surface for around 12 hours, and they are both worried. They've deployed a robot, Unit SPD-13, who is nicknamed Speedy. Speedy was sent on a mission to seek out a nearby selenium pool and return with some selenium to power the space station's shields that can offer protection against the harsh temperatures on Mercury's surface. According to Donovan's tracking radio, Speedy has spent the last 4 hours circling a pool of selenium, continuously orbiting the pool without getting any closer. They know that if they don't find a solution, it will soon begin to be cooked to death, so they employ some more primitive machines to investigate what's going on. The two men suit up and mount one of the machines, and travel across the surface towards the errant robot's location, while avoiding the harsh sunlight. They arrive at the selenium pool, and call out to Speedy to get an idea of what's going on. Speedy continues to say nonsensical things, and quote Gilbert and Sullivan, before resuming to lurch around the area. Powell questions Donovan and asks what he programmed Speedy to do. Donovan states that he spoke simply and told the machine to go collect selenium and bring it back to the ship. Powell runs down the 3 laws of robotics. 1. A robot may not injure a human being, or through an action, allow one to come to harm. 2. That a robot must obey orders given by any human, provided that that order doesn't contradict the first law. 3. A robot must protect its own existence, as long as its actions don't contradict the preceding two laws. Powell realizes what's wrong. Speedy is an expensive robot, so as a precaution, emphasis was put on the third law by the manufacturers. The second rule means that Speedy heads towards the pool, but the third keeps him from ever reaching his destination. The explorers are facing a conundrum. The walk towards the pool will result in their deaths from constant exposure to the sun, while the transports they brought aren't capable of traveling to collect the material. In the end, the men spend time traveling back to the station and return with corrosive acid that will damage Speedy. They are running short on time before their suits fail, so they attempt to drive Speedy to collect the selenium by throwing the acid behind the robot, driving the machine towards the selenium pool. Speedy's third law takes effect and he flees the scene. Powell yells, frustrated that they've just wasted their time. They can't retrieve Speedy and time is running short. Powell realizes that they need to take drastic action, so he quickly tells Donovan his final plan. Powell walks out into the sunlight, and as the sun hits his suit, he calls out to tell Speedy that he's going to die quickly if he doesn't get help, forcing the robot to adhere to the first law of robotics. The robotic transports attempt to rescue Powell, but Speedy reaches Powell before the transports. Powell falls unconscious and is eventually revived by Donovan. Donovan tells him that Speedy brought him back to the station. Donovan then sent Speedy to retrieve material at all costs, placing emphasis on the second law. Speedy arrives, and the men are able to save themselves and the ship. I, James Blunt. This is a 1942 story published by the Ministry of Information in Great Britain and written by the journalist H.V. Morton. The book is told from the perspective of an English tradesman who lives in a Nazi-occupied Britain. He chronicles the Germanization and brainwashing of the invaders, and tells of St. Paul being razed and replaced by a German political headquarters, and resistance being crushed by heavy policing. The Puppet Masters. The Puppet Masters is an older Robert Heinlein story. In this universe, the year is 2007, and America and the combined Soviet bloc, consisting of the USSR and China, are rebuilding from a brief nuclear exchange. An invasion is underway. Slug-like aliens invade the US. These creatures attach to the back of their respective hosts and are capable of mind control. The serialized stories chronicled the fight between the US government and these alien invaders. The book ends with the defeat of the aliens and the US preparing to invade Saturn to take the offensive. The Man Who Sold the Moon. This is another Heinlein story. The Man Who Sold the Moon is an account of the first moon landing in 1978. It describes the attempts of Delos Harriman, an infamous robber baron, to reach the moon and secure it for capitalism. Harriman is successful in his ventures, reaches the moon far before the Russians or the US government. Using slight manipulation, he gains the backing of corporations like Coca-Cola and 6up, those are from the book, for his venture. Some of Harriman's initial ideas include using the moon as a giant billboard and commercially selling acreage on the surface. The story concludes after Harriman successfully sends a man to the moon, who returns with evidence of the mineral wealth of the planet. In the Wet. In the Wet is a 1951 book written by Neville Shute. It describes Britain in 1983 through the dreams of a man on his deathbed in the 50s named Stevie. Stevie is dying. He begins to describe the future to an Anglican priest who has come to administer communion to the sick and last rites. Stevie tells the story of a technologically advanced Britain in 1983, ruled by Queen Elizabeth II. This version of Britain is far more socialist than its non-fictional counterpart, with the royal family still present, but heavily disliked by the socialists. The royal family lose much of their former accoutrements, such as private aircraft. The more monarchist parts of the Commonwealth, such as Australia and New Zealand, help provide for the Queen and her family. The book mostly details the flight of the royals to Australia, and the later reforming of the British government into a country that more resembles our own. The Black Cloud. This entry refers to the book of the same name, published in 1957 by the astronomer Fred Hoyle. The novel's focus lies on the arrival of an interstellar cloud in the solar system in 1964. The cloud is estimated to arrive in Earth's atmosphere and is thick enough to catastrophically reduce the sunlight reaching the surface. A dedicated team of scientists set out to figure out an effective way to survive as the cloud approaches. Journey to the Prehistoric Planet. This is a 1965 sci-fi movie set in the year 2020. A group of 5 astronauts and a robot are sent on a quest to investigate Venus. The team makes planetfall and discover that the surface is inhabited by prehistoric creatures, dinosaurs, and active volcanoes. The team takes samples and evacuates before a volcanic eruption can knock out their craft. Rollerball. Rollerball is a 1975 sci-fi film set in 2018, starring James Caan. In 2018, corporations have replaced existing countries, and teams compete in rollerball, a gladiator-like roller sport. 5 countries exist, consisting of transport, food, energy, housing, communication, and luxury. Each corporation fields its own teams of rollerball players. The main character, Jonathan E., is an anti-corporate player who, despite the urgings of the game's promoters, refuses to retire, instead playing to reform the sport before the sport kills him. Future Boy Conan. This is a 1978 anime taking place in 2008. In the setting of Future Boy Conan, humanity is on the brink of its extinction after a massive war that was fought with ultramagnetic weapons. Continents sink and oceans shift in the midst of this cataclysmic conflict, resulting in a raised post-apocalyptic setting. A group of survivors try to escape the apocalypse in a spaceship, but the ship is forced back down to Earth, and the survivors are left on an island. A freshwater well is uncovered, and the crew live a happy life in this wasteland. A single boy, named Conan, is born in the community. The crew eventually begin to pass away from old age, leaving Conan and his adoptive grandfather. I'm not going to give away the entire plot, but Conan soon has to leave the island on a quest to stop another apocalypse after raiders kill his guardian and attempt to kidnap him. Escape from New York. It's 1997. The last stage of a war between the Soviet Union and the US is nearing its end. Manhattan has been transformed into a maximum security prison. The US president is en route to a peace conference in Air Force One, up until the plane is hijacked and the president is taken hostage. A convicted bank robber and former Special Forces soldier named Snake Plissken is sent in to rescue the president in time for him to get to the peace conference. It's a cult classic, and it helped inspire Kojima to create Solid Snake, one of the protagonists of the Metal Gear Solid games. V is for Vendetta. This is a graphic novel written by Alan Moore and illustrated by David Lloyd. It revolves around the struggles of a masked vigilante known as V against a neo-fascist Britain. After nuclear war in the late 80s, Britain was left as a famine-stricken wasteland, allowing an extremist groups under the banner of the political party Norsefire to seize control. A company with close ties to the Norsefire regime, named Larkhill, ran inhuman experiments on a variety of test subjects. The experimental bioweapon killed all the inmates at the site, with the exception of one man. This man was left scarred and disfigured, but with improved physical strength. The survivor became the Vigilante V. The graphic novel series chronicles his fight and the rise of the people against the Norsefire-controlled government. Fists of the North Star. This entry refers to the TV series, not the original graphic novels. The year 1990X. The world is an irradiated wasteland after a nuclear holocaust. The strong rule over the weak, and food and water sources are viciously fought over by the remaining survivors. Survivor known as Kenshiro carries on the martial arts tradition of Fukoto Shinken, also known as Fists of the North Star. The anime records his quests around the dangerous wasteland. 12 Monkeys. James Cole, a prisoner played by Bruce Willis, is a prisoner living in the year 2035, the aftermath of a global plague that wiped out much of the human population. He's sent back in time by scientists to stop the army of the 12 Monkeys, an extremist group that released the virus that has driven humanity deep underground. Fortunately for Bruce Willis, he's been sent to 1990, not 1996, the year in which the army of the 12 Monkeys made their move. He's placed in a mental hospital. After being forcibly sedated, Bruce is able to make his escape back to the 2030s. He's sent back yet again, this time to World War I, before successfully being transported to 1996. It gets pretty convoluted from there, but Bruce spends the rest of the film's runtime chasing Dr. Riley, a supposed member of the army of the 12 Monkeys who sent Bruce to the mental hospital earlier. Enlon 2000. This was a series of images from the turn of the 20th century, imagining what technology in the year 2000 would look like. These images were produced by a variety of artists, were intended to illustrate postcards, and even cigar box inserts. My favorite image from the series is this one, involving microbes. Tier 3. The Battle of Dorking. This work is subtitled Reminiscences of a Volunteer. This was an 1871 short story written by George Tompkins Chesney shortly after the conclusion of the Franco-Prussian War. Europe had witnessed the speed and seeming invincibility of the Prussian armies during the war. Chesney grew concerned that Britain was unprepared and vulnerable to the might of the Teutonic forces. He wrote this book as a cautionary tale to warn Britain of not resting on its laurels. The Battle of Dorking is written from the perspective of a British soldier telling his grandchildren what happened 50 years previously. In this book, Prussian armies began to build up near the Netherlands in preparation for invasion of England. Using an unnamed superweapon and heavy naval power, the Royal Navy is obliterated and Prussian troops arrive on British shores. Demilitarization results in the British Army struggling to put together an effective fighting force, and militia units are hastily assembled to meet the invaders. The militias clash in Dorking, Surrey. The Prussian determination and high standard of training results in a heavy defeat for the British, resulting in the storyteller and others fleeing the battle in disgrace. The Prussians ransom Parliament, and the empire is broken up. Canada and the area of the West Indies are annexed by the US, and Ireland, Australia, and New Zealand gain independence. In the end, Germany and Austria-Hungary take control of Malta and Gibraltar, resulting in a new superpower dominating Europe. Anno Domini 2000, or Woman's Destiny. This 1889 book is considered the first New Zealand sci-fi novel. Anno Domini imagined New Zealand 2000 being administered by a female prime minister. It chronicles the term of Hilda Fitzherbert. Some interesting points in the book include a war between the UK and the United States, and the re-entering of the US into the Empire. News from nowhere. Once again, this entry involves someone falling asleep and waking up in the future. William Guest, the primary narrator, falls asleep during a Socialist Party meeting and wakes up in a socialist future. However, the book differs from the earlier entry in The Iceberg, Looking Backwards. Whereas Looking Backwards advocated state socialism, News from Nowhere focused on a more libertarian viewpoint, where people's work is exclusively creative and pleasurable to the individual. The book has more poetic structure and places special emphasis on the relation between men and women in an idealized socialist utopia. The Great War in England in 1897. This is a speculative novel fiction written by William Lequesne. The book imagines an invasion of southern England by a combined French-Russian landing force. The British hold out in Devon until more forces from the Commonwealth and Germany arrive to help the defenders. Old New Land. This entry refers to a utopian novel published in 1902 by Theodor Herzl, widely considered the founder of political Zionism. Lowenberg, a young Jewish intellectual, joins a Prussian aristocrat on a secluded island, isolated from the rest of the world. On their trip to the Pacific, the two men make a visit to Palestine and observe incredible poverty and hunger commonplace. The two complete their 20-year-long hiatus on a remote island in the Cook Island chain. As they stop back in Palestine, the two men observe a radically changed region. A Jewish-led organization called the New Society has taken control, and European Jews have resettled the Alt-New Land, or German for Old New Land, in the former land of Palestine. This state is prosperous, features high-tech machinery, and a democratic form of governance. Arabs have equal rights with Jewish citizens, and various ethnicities ranging from Arabs to Armenians to Greeks have seats on the council. By the way, Alt-New Land roughly translates to Tel Aviv in Hebrew, the name of the former capital of Israel. The War in the Air. This is a novel written by H.G. Wells, the famous author of books like The War of the Worlds. The War in the Air initially follows the life of the main character, Bert Smallways. Bert has a relatively normal life as a bicycle repairman. One day, he encounters a man emerging from a hot air balloon near his hometown. This man is Mr. Butteridge, a man who, unbeknownst to Smallways, has made a working, heavier-than-air aircraft. Butteridge extends a job opportunity to Smallways. He needs a crewman to assist in a balloon voyage towards continental Europe. He accepts the job and joins the long flight with Butteridge. Butteridge and Smallways take off, and Butteridge tells of his new invention, the airplane. He intends to sell these secrets to either the British or German militaries. The balloon is shot down in a strange area near Hamburg, Germany, and soldiers take Butteridge away. The two have accidentally stumbled on a massive German air fleet preparing to attack the United States. Smallways joins the fleet. He is taken as a witness to the campaign against the Americans, accompanied by their leader, Prince Karl Albert. The German invasion fleet is composed of massive numbers of airships and experimental airplanes called Drachenfliegers. The Germans are intending to launch a surprise attack on the Americans before the American aerial forces can be assembled. Germany has grown tired of American imperialism and interference with their ambitions in South America. Meanwhile, in the far Pacific, the Confederacy of East Asia, composed of China and Japan, are aggravated by the constant intrusions of the US in their territory, and are preparing a massive air assault. Smallways watches as German forces invade New York. The Germans bomb multiple key points without taking damage, and force the surrender of New York City. Patriotic Americans in the city form militias, and take out an airship using an artillery piece. The Germans are offended by the breaking of this supposed surrender, and Broadway is destroyed by heavy firebombing from above. The fledgling American Air Force leads a suicidal charge against the Germans, resulting in the destruction of the Americans at a heavy cost to the German forces. German forces make a landing from airships in Niagara Falls, continue to control American territory up until Buffalo, New York. A large airfield is built on US soil. The Asian coalition attacks on the west coast using ornithopters, pushing American forces past the Rockies. Asian air groups engage German airships in combat near the Rockies. The ornithopters are equipped with guns that fire incendiary bullets, obliterating the German airships. The Germans in the East Coast surrender, with some veterans joining the American rebels. Smallways joins the Americans and gives the Butteridge machine designs to the American president. The war between the Asian Confederacy and the US turns into a world war, resulting in a massive battle in Europe between the Germans and Britain. Britain destroys Berlin, where a counterattack from invading Asian forces destroys London. After the destruction of many major cities, the world suffers economic collapse, and a plague sends the broken nations into the Dark Ages. Things to come. This entry refers to a 1936 movie written by H.G. Wells. It centers around a 30-year war that resembles World War I. Planes drop poison gas on war-torn fields, covered in fortifications in dug-in positions. The war continues until Britain and its unnamed enemy are reduced to ash heaps from constant conflict. But a pacifist group called Wings Over the World comes to restore order to the world, and with it, bring about technological progress. When Smuts Goes. This is a dystopian novel written by Dr. Arthur Keppel Jones. In this book, Jan Smuts is defeated in a major election in the 1940s. The opposing Nationalist Party wins, imposing complete apartheid and severing ties with the British Commonwealth. The book actually accurately predicted what would happen to South Africa. Smuts was indeed defeated by even more extreme segregationists, and apartheid was forced onto the people of the country. Mars is Heaven. This is a short story by my favorite author, Ray Bradbury, that features in the Martian Chronicles. It's 1960. A crew of astronauts have arrived on Mars, but to their shock, they discover an idyllic small American town that resembles their respective hometowns back in the US. The people of the town seem to think the year is 1926, and the crew members discover their friends and passed away relatives living happily in this Martian community. The crewmen abandon their rocket and greet their respective friends and enjoy tearful reunions and festivities. The astronauts split up to spend time with their families. The captain of the rocket is skeptical and discovers that this American town was contrived by telepathic Martians who seek to defend themselves against the first wave of settlers from Earth. Before he can warn the others, the entire crew is killed by the Martians. Overall, this story illustrates the vivid imagery Bradbury used in his works. If you haven't read it yet, I would recommend the series of loosely connected stories that form the narrative of the Martian Chronicles. It's hard to describe the collection in a few words, but the stories range from bizarre horror to prose that, for lack of a better analogy, makes me nostalgic for someone else's childhood. Strange Adventures, number 1. This is an old comic book series that released its first issue in 1950. It received a modern redux in 2020 from DC Comics, but I can't vouch for how the new version resembles the old. In the early 21st century, Chris, KL99, is voyaging through space with his dog, Loopy, a Martian adventurer named Hulk, and Jero, a Venusian scientist. They are photomapping a water world, prepare to return in their ship and go back to home base. However, their ship is threatened by a giant magnet, forcing them to strip the steel components of the hull. They eventually make it back to Earth, no worse for wear. Dan Dare. Dan Dare is a British comic book hero and is often considered the British equivalent of America's Buck Rogers. The character made his first appearance on the Radio Luxembourg program, a multilingual station that broadcasted Dan Dare, Pilot of the Future, in the early 50s. He also featured prominently in British comic book magazines Eagle and later 2000 AD. Childhood's End. It's the end of the 20th century. The US and the USSR are about to achieve nuclear-powered space travel. Right before both countries initiate their respective launches, massive alien spacecraft appear over every major city. The book cuts to 5 years after this event. The aliens have taken over the entire world, and their flagship resides over New York City. The story follows the attempted rebellion against this alien race, referred to as the Overlords. The book was written by Arthur C. Clarke. Cities in Flight. Cities in Flight is a 4-volume series of novelettes and short stories written by the writer James Blish. The series begins in 2018. The USSR and US are still engaged in a Cold War, and constant security restrictions result in the US becoming more of a police state. Senator Bliss Wagoner of Alaska is the chairman of the Joint Congressional Committee on Spaceflight. He's determined to return the US to the true democracy it once was. He begins research into a variety of different fields that would allow for space colonies. Due to advancements in heavy shielding, anti-grav technology, and anti-aging drugs, floating space cities become a distinct possibility. Wagoner is arrested by the FBI and accused of treason, but not before he sends scouting missions to space. These early expeditions were able to form small space colonies, and malcontents and people seeking to leave Earth take the opportunity to join the space race. The series follows the travels of the space cities from 2018 to the end of the universe. Battle in Outer Space. This entry is a 1959 Japanese sci-fi movie directed by the man famous for his work on Godzilla, Ishiro Honda. This film imagines a war between humanity and extraterrestrials in the year 1965. The UN discovers evidence that aliens have established a base on the moon. They deploy 2 scout craft to investigate the surface, and combat teams soon discover an alien base within one of the deep lunar craters. A firefight breaks out between the aggressive aliens and the scouting teams, and the team successfully destroys the enemy outpost. The crew make it back to Earth, and the world prepares for a massive invasion, building fleets of rocket-powered fighter craft and atomic heat cannons. The fleet arrives, and modified spaceships are deployed to defend against the alien invaders. Mankind wins, but not before the aliens level Tokyo, New York City, and San Francisco. This is a 1969 novel by Philip K. Dick. This work is set in 1992. By 1992, the moon is colonized and psychic powers are commonplace. Joe Chip, the main protagonist, is working for a firm that employs people who have the gift to block psychics, thereby ensuring security for major corporations. The book follows an unusual event that occurs when a routine psychic protection job goes wrong for Joe Chip and the members of his firm, and each chapter revolves around advertisements for a product with incredible godlike capabilities called Ubik, the Lathe of Heaven. This is set in an alternate Portland in 2002. The population is immensely poor, and addiction is a daunting issue for the city's inhabitants. George Orr is an addict who takes large quantities of drugs to stop his dreams from becoming reality. Orr is later threatened with incarceration and given treatment for his addiction. He's put in a series of therapy sessions with a psychiatrist and sleep researcher named William Haber. He tells Haber of his ability to turn dreams into real-world events, and after evidence begins to form, the psychiatrist believes him. In one session, Haber tells him to dream of a world without overpopulation. A plague manifests, reducing much of Earth's population in just a few short days. George is told to dream of peace on Earth, and an alien invasion occurs, uniting mankind under one banner. The resulting changes continue to grant Haber more power in the alternate timelines made by George. In the end, Haber tells George Orr to stop dreaming, resulting in Haber gaining a knowledge of the possible multiverses. The universe is fractured into a combination of various realities, and George finds a new job in an alien-owned kitchenware store. Mal-Evil. In this story, written by the French author Robert Merle, landowner Emmanuel Comte is living a peaceful existence in rural France. He owns an old castle named Mal-Evil, which he's turned into a tourist attraction. Comte is in the process of showing his close friends the newly renovated wine cellar when nuclear war breaks out. The group in the cellar hole up until the initial devastation ceases, then venture out into the ruined wasteland that surrounds the castle. They take the next several years to rebuild a new society, inviting people willing to join their society and fighting raiders. The Texas-Israeli War, 1999. This entry refers to a book published in 1974. In this parallel timeline, the world has been ravaged by massive chemical and biological fallout from an apocalyptic war. Nuclear arsenals were limited in a 1983 treaty, and an ensuing war utilizing missile-borne pathogen warheads left a massive portion of the human population dead from disease and later famine. Texas secedes from the US, resulting in a massive war between the two countries. As a result, the US employs Israeli soldiers to fight, promising land to the victors. Israel was one of the few nations to survive relatively unscathed, making it a superpower in comparison to the wrecked countries and are the remnants of the USSR, China, and the US. The book chronicles the story of an Israeli commander leading an armored brigade of nuclear-powered tanks with laser Gatling cannons on a mission deep into the heart of Texas to rescue the captured American president. Miami, 2017. This is a Billy Joel song that imagines an alternate 2017. Its subtitle reads, "I've Seen the Lights Go Out on Broadway." It was written by Joel in 1975, as Billy Joel grew concerned with the rampant crime growing in his beloved New York City. This song is written from the perspective of an old man living in Florida in 2017, telling the story of an apocalypse that completely obliterated the city. A Wind Named Amnesia. A Wind Named Amnesia is a 1990 anime film based off of a novel by Japanese author Hideyuki Kikuchi. A wind has blown across the world, wiping away everyone's memories of how to perform basic functions, like breathing, talking, and Boolean algebra. The Noah's Ark Principle. This is a film set in 1997. Weapons of mass destruction are gone. Above the Earth exists Florida Ark Lab, a space station that is a result of European and American research and funding. The station is capable of controlling the weather at any given location on the globe. The film's protagonist, Billy Hayes, is an astronaut spending time aboard the station. He ends up being caught up in an attempt to weaponize the station. Interesting side note, this entire film was funded by students from West Germany and was on their budgets. America. This is the incomplete version of Franz Kafka's first story. Franz Kafka was an author of the modernist and absurdist genres. It was written in 1917 and describes an America that is a satire of the process of immigrating to the US in the early 20th century. One difference between the 1920s version of the US and our own is that the Statue of Liberty is holding a sword. 2020 Visions. This was a 2004 limited comic series written by Jamie Delano and published by DC. In this version of 2020, a horrendous venereal disease is rampant, and people wear masks and stay isolated. I just want to say, this is the second entry on the iceberg to predict an pandemic in 2020. Pretty interesting. On the Beach. This is a classic dystopian novel written in 1959 by Nevil Shute. In 1963, a massive nuclear war between a variety of countries results in horrendous radioactive fallout. Many of the bombs include cobalt, a substance that increases the radioactivity, causing greater radiation damage and salting of the earth. The book is from the perspective of residents in Melbourne, Australia, living out their final days before the oncoming winds bear radioactive dust to snuff out their lives. Tier 4. Berlin Without Jews. Berlin Without Jews is a 1925 novel by Arthur Landsberger. Predicts a dystopian reality where a nationalist group assumes power and forces the Jewish population out of Berlin. It is told from the perspective of two families, one composed of Lutherans and one composed of Jews. What happens during this forced displacement by the government? It can't happen here. This is a novel by Sinclair Lewis, and it's currently on my reading list. It Can't Happen Here describes the rise of a dictator in the US. Senator Berzelius Windrip, a power-mad senator from an unnamed state, runs for president, promising to give each citizen a variety of monetary benefits during his election. Windrip wins, running on a populist platform and defeating FDR and Trowbridge, the respective Democratic and Republican candidates. President Windrip proceeds to enact authoritarian measures, building concentration camps for dissidents, and organizing a paramilitary organization similar to the Brown Shirts' Cosmic Voyage. This film is a 1936 silent movie made in Soviet Russia. The film imagines a moon landing taking place in 1947, and, for the most part, gives an accurate representation of what a moon landing would be like. The Sentinel. The Sentinel is a short story written by Arthur C. Clarke. and used as a prequel to 2001: A Space Odyssey. It describes the discovery of a tetrahedral monolithic artifact surrounded by a force field on the surface of the moon. El Eternauta. This entry is a classic sci-fi comic created by the Argentinian Hector German Osterheld and serialized between 1957 and 1959. It's widely considered a masterpiece of the genre throughout South America. The plot follows a family and their friends who barely survive a mysterious snowstorm that wipes out most of the population of Buenos Aires. Juan Salvo, his small family, and a few of his old friends named Favali, Lucas, and Polsky are able to survive in their home thanks to an ingenious plan. They make improvised spacesuits during their trips to the outside world, uncover a few survivors. They learn from a young boy that the snowfall was the preliminary to a massive alien invasion. The men link up with the remaining members of the army and lead a resistance against the invaders. They encounter giant insects, elephantine beasts, and cyborg creatures. These alien beings have implanted chips, are being enslaved by unseen forces. After a series of victories, their unit begins to take heavy losses and disbands. Juan returns to his wife and daughter in Buenos Aires. The family makes it out of the city right before a devastating nuclear attack hits, obliterating an alien base in the center of town. The aliens begin to lure the survivors to the few hospitable zones left. Juan Salvo makes his escape from the aliens, embarking in an alien vessel with his family. He accidentally activates the time travel function, sending the ship deep into the continuum. Juan's family is lost, and at the end of the book he goes on a quest to find them again, earning him the moniker Eternauta, or Voyager of Eternity. All you zombies. This Robert Heinlein story follows a young man, later revealed to be intersex, going back in time, marrying his younger female self before undergoing reassignment surgery. The character is in fact both the child, father, and mother in this relationship. In fact, every major character in the book is the main character at different points of his life. The War Game. This documentary from 1966 tells the story of the fallout of a nuclear war. China invades South Vietnam, triggering a global confrontation between the major superpowers. The War Game shows the horrendous effects of a nuclear attack on Britain, from the horrible disfigurements caused by the blinding initial flash of the explosion to the deteriorating infrastructure and quality of life. Stand on Zanzibar. This book is a series of subplots and vignettes examining what culture would be like in an alternate 2010s. Overpopulation threatens the world, and microorganisms are used as terrorist weapons. Over the course of the book, readers are exposed to a variety of slang terms used by the inhabitants of this world, and given brief exposure to alien concepts and events. Prophecies of Nostradamus. This refers to a 1974 film released in Japan. A professor, who has spent time researching works of Nostradamus, grows increasingly sure that a major apocalypse is imminent. Despite his warnings to politicians, a breach of the ozone layer, followed by, you guessed it, nuclear war, leaves the world in ruins. Some scenes involving cannibals were considered so violent that Japanese rating boards forced the director to remove the film and cut the offensive scenes. At the moment, uncut copies of the film are rare and hard to find. Flow my tears, the policeman said. This Philip K. Dick novel is set in an alternate 1988. America has emerged out of the Second American Civil War as a dictatorship where recreational drugs are freely distributed to keep the population in check. The age of consent has been lowered dramatically. Minorities have been driven close to extinction by the ruling elite. Personal airplanes are used even more than cars, resulting in fast travel for those who are allowed to travel. Urban Strike. This older EA shoot-'em-up style game is set in 2001. H.R. Malone, A media mogul who was once a candidate for the presidency is running again on a platform to reform the government and defeat organized crime. You take the place of an agent sent to stop Malone's secret plan to construct a superweapon to destabilize the American government in one fell swoop. Tier 5. Insatiability. This entry is a 1927 novel written by the eminent Polish writer and painter Witaki. The novel is set in a time somewhere around the year 2000 and tells of Poland being overrun by the great final Mongol conquest. The conquering government distributes pills that destroy the free will of the Polish people. East and West become one under tyrannical rule. For Us, the Living, a comedy of customs. This is another Robert Heinlein story. In the year 1939, a Navy pilot named Perry Nelson is driving along when his car experiences a blowout on an icy highway road, resulting in his car skidding off a cliff face. Nelson wakes up in the wreckage of the car and walks towards the nearest signs of civilization. He's on the verge of dying from freezing right before he's rescued by a woman in furs named Diana. He's told he's in the year 2086, is given information by his rescuer on the state of governance and life in the late 21st century. Aelita. Aelita is a silent film era movie made by the USSR. Revolves around an engineer daydreaming in a factory, dreaming of a fantastical world on Mars. In his imagination, he travels to the planet Mars in a rocket ship and leads a glorious revolution against the monarchist oppressors ruling the workers on Mars. It's like John Carter, but communist. Future of a New China. This is an unfinished novel from 1902 by Kui Chao, a well-known politician and political activist at the time. The novel takes place in 1962, showing a 50th anniversary celebration taking place somewhere in China. The people are commemorating the anniversary reform movement that turned China into a powerful constitutional monarchy. The second part of the book describes a Chinese orator giving a lecture to a massive crowd of Chinese-speaking students from different countries, telling them of what happened between 1902 and 1960 to bring their country to be. There Will Come Soft Rains. This is a Ray Bradbury short story that is in the Martian Chronicles collection. A nuclear blast leaves a single home in Allendale, California, intact. Within the home, daily automated systems continue. Systems clean the home, prepare breakfast, address the deceased family, continue the routine of an average 50s nuclear family household. At one point, the house lets in a dog, a former family pet, but the dog dies and is soon incinerated by the cleaning systems of the home. The house recites the long-gone housewife's favorite poem, There Will Come Soft Rains, by Sarah Teasdale. A fire breaks out in the home. Despite the fire control system's best efforts, the house burns down, leaving a single wall that repeats the current time and date. Tier 6. The Secret People. In this 1935 novel, set in the mid-60s, the Third Reich still exists as a peaceful superpower, and the Sahara has been flooded to form a new sea. A man named Mark Sennett crashes his rocket plane into an island inside of the massive sea. He, along with his companion Margaret Lawn, are sucked into a cavern and taken into captivity by a race of pygmies. Folk Songs for the 21st Century. This is a concept album made by the folk singer Sheldon Allman as part of the Atomic Craze movement in the early 60s, matching a futuristic and sometimes post-apocalyptic series of settings. Some of the songs from this album featured in the game Fallout 4. Tier 7. A Journey in the City of Amalgamation, the Year of Our Lord, 19-. This is an 1812 novel written by the anti-abolitionist Jerome B. Holgate in 1835. The book imagines a city that features no segregation, and according to the author, is a despicable hive of scum and villainy. The overall plot features some offensive themes, horrendous stereotyping and tries to present interracial marriage as something morally offensive, so I will not be covering the plot here. I'll leave that to you. Christianismi Restitutio. This is a theological work published in 1553, covering the topic of predestination. Besides these theological elements, one of the more interesting parts of this book, correctly predicted, our modern model of the circulatory system and unintentionally predicted groundbreaking discoveries in the field of the human body. Unfortunately, the author, Michael Servatus, was arrested by the Spanish Inquisition and burned at the stake before he could publish any more theories on the human body. That is the final entry on the iceberg. I hope you enjoyed the video. I didn't cover every entry on the iceberg, so you're welcome to go to the original post using the link below and conduct your own research on these entries. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around. Take care, and good night.